My name is Elena, and I spent 25 years being the unplanned mistake that my parents kept tucked away in the guest wing of our mansion. I was the shadow at every family dinner, the girl who wasn't allowed in the annual holiday photos, and the secret they apologized for whenever a guest asked why. I looked nothing like my perfect older brother. The night everything changed. I wasn't crying in my room or begging for their approval. I was standing in the middle of our 30th anniversary gala, a glass of champagne in my hand, watching my father smile as he introduced my brother as the only true heir to the family legacy. He turned to me, his voice dripping with condescending pity, and told the room that I was the reason they had struggled for so long. A total, irreversible mistake. The silence that followed was heavy, stifling, and suffocating. Everyone waited for me to look down or walk away. They expected the mistake to crumble. Instead, I stepped onto the stage and took the microphone. That single word didn't just break my heart. It opened the door to the truth they had spent 2 decades burying. My older brother, Julian, was the architect of our family's curated existence. While I was relegated to the drafty guest wing, Julian occupied the sun-drenched master suite, his life a steady rhythm of praise, Ivy League acceptance letters, and expensive rowing lessons. My parents treated him like a fragile masterpiece that required constant preservation, whereas I was treated like a smudge of ink on a pristine white canvas, an unfortunate error that needed to be scrubbed away. They didn't just favor him. They actively performed a ritual of neglect toward me, ensuring I understood that my existence was a burden they tolerated, only out of social obligation. At the dinner table, the atmosphere was suffocatingly polarized. My father would listen to Julian's mundane updates about his business internships, as if they were divine revelations, his eyes softening with an adoration I never received. When I attempted to speak, the air in the room would thin, the clink of silverware becoming the only response to my presence. They would exchange long-suffering glances that spoke volumes. I was the unplanned accident, the friction in their otherwise smooth high society machine. I grew up watching their eyes light up at the mere mention of Julian's name, contrasted by the sharp, impatient glint that appeared whenever they remembered I was in the room. They never hugged me, never celebrated my small triumphs, and never once asked about the dreams I whispered to my bedroom ceiling at night. To them, I was a mistake they had to balance on their ledger. They lived in a world of performance, where Julian was the star and I was the stagehand meant to remain in the dark. I learned early that invisibility was the only way to survive their scrutiny, but the deeper their neglect grew, the more I became an expert in studying their flaws. I watched their perfect lives unfold, memorizing every fracture, waiting for the perfect moment to pull the thread. The most vivid memory was the night of my father's retirement banquet, an event where the city's elite gathered to toast his integrity. I was 15, and my mother had explicitly forbidden me from entering the dining hall. I was to remain in the basement, confined to the shadows, while guests walked past the door that led to my living space. When a high-profile senator accidentally wandered toward my hallway, my mother moved with a frantic animalistic speed. She didn't just guide him back. She literally blocked the corridor, her face pale with a terror that far exceeded mere social embarrassment. She hissed at me to kill the lights and stay silent, her eyes wide with a cold, desperate panic that had nothing to do with my outfit or my grades. In that suffocating darkness, I realized her fear wasn't about me being a disappointment. It was about me being a potential witness to a narrative that didn't exist. She was covering up a fracture in their reality that was deeper than blood. My existence wasn't just an inconvenience to them. It was a liability. That night, I stopped being a daughter and became an observer of their elaborate, fraudulent construction. The breakthrough happened during a relentless summer thunderstorm, the kind that turned our mansion into an isolated fortress. My parents were away, leaving me to my usual exile, so I retreated to the attic to find an old book. Instead, I found a loose floorboard beneath a stack of Julian's childhood trophies. Prying it open, I uncovered a heavy, dust-covered steel box that didn't belong in our orderly home. Inside were thick, legal-looking envelopes embossed with the seal of a firm. I recognized the same firm that handled my father's high-stakes corporate accounts. As I scanned the documents, the air in the attic seemed to vanish. These weren't just private letters. They were birth records and financial affidavits from 25 years ago. The files detailed a complex web of identity fraud involving a family trust that had been established long before my parents were even married. The money that funded our opulent life, the very wealth that bought my brothers accolades and my parents' social standing did not belong to them. It belonged to the estate of an estranged relative who had died without an heir, and my parents had orchestrated a massive systematic theft. The most damning piece was a secondary birth certificate, one that bore my name but listed a different lineage, a lineage that held the actual claim to the trust. I wasn't just a mistake. I was their greatest security. They had used my identity, the legitimate successor to a fortune they had stolen, to create an elaborate tax shelter that fueled their rise to power. My existence was a legal shield, a pawn in a game of embezzlement that would land them in federal prison for life. I stood there in the dark, the weight of the papers trembling in my hands. As the realization washed over me, I wasn't a family member. I was a living asset. I had finally found the thread that would unravel their entire, perfect existence. For the next 3 months, I played the most intoxicating role of my life. I returned to being the invisible, clumsy mistake at dinner, enduring my father's biting comments about my lack of direction and my mother's cold, pointed silence. Every time they insulted me, I felt a spark of electric joy run through my veins. They were insulting the only person who could dismantle their entire world with a single signature. I spent my nights in the basement meticulously curating the exposed folder. I photocopied every damning document, cross-referenced bank transfers from the trust with my parents, own corporate acquisitions, and drafted a concise, devastating timeline of their fraud. I even made duplicates, placing them in a secure off-site lockbox, just in case my disappearance became convenient. The psychological game was exquisite. I would watch my mother laugh about her social triumphs and imagine the exact moment that laugh would turn into a frantic, high-pitched scream. I started wearing my hair differently and walking with a newfound, subtle grace that they couldn't quite interpret. I was no longer just the daughter they kept for tax benefits and insurance claims. I was their silent auditor, watching them commit their daily sins with the full knowledge that their clock had finally run out. I kept the folder beneath the floorboards, a heavy, paper-filled anchor that held the weight of their destruction, waiting for the gala where I would finally let them fall. When the music finally lulled, I walked toward the stage with the rhythmic grace of a predator who had finished the hunt. My father, still basking in the warmth of his self-constructed ego, gestured for me to leave, his face tightening with a mix of disdain and confusion. I didn't leave. I stepped onto the platform, adjusted the microphone, and the feedback hummed through the room like a warning. I didn't shout, didn't stammer, and didn't plead for their love. I simply smiled, a cold, sharp expression that caused my mother to drop, her fork against her plate with a deafening clatter. "My father called me a mistake earlier," I said, my voice projecting clearly into the rafters. "He's right, but only because I was never meant to witness what happens when a mistake is actually a rightful heir." The room froze, the clink of glasses replaced by a vacuum of sound. I pulled the exposed folder from beneath my clutch. I didn't throw it. I laid it onto the podium with the weight of a judge's gavel. I pulled out the secondary birth certificate and the ledger of the stolen family trust, then held them up toward the floodlights. "For 25 years, I've been your secret, your tax shelter, and your pawn," I continued, watching my father's face drain of all color, his arrogant posture folding like a house of cards. "But you made one critical error. You treated the person holding the keys to your entire existence as if she didn't exist, signaled for the catering staff, who were instructed to hand out the duplicates I had slipped them earlier. Panic erupted like wildfire. My mother tried to stand, her mouth opening in a frantic, silent plea, but her legs buckled. My father lunged toward the stage, his eyes wide with a feral, hollow terror that finally replaced his smug, performative mask. I looked down at them, the mistake finally standing taller than the architects of the lie, watching their perfect life disintegrate into a pile of subpoena-worthy paper. The gala disintegrated into a cacophony of shattered crystal and frantic murmurs. Guests who had spent decades bowing to my father now huddled together, frantically reading the copies of the trust embezzlement that spelled his ruin. My mother was sobbing in the corner, a sound that lacked any real grief, mourning only the public death of her status. I didn't stay to watch the final collapse of their legal defenses. I didn't need to. I had already contacted the federal authorities and the executor of the original estate before the first course was served. As I walked toward the heavy oak exit, I felt the air shift around me. The heavy, suffocating weight of being their secret had completely evaporated, replaced by the clean, sharp oxygen of autonomy. I walked out into the cool night, no longer their mistake, but their final, irreversible consequence, being called a mistake. was the catalyst that forced me to look for the truth they desperately tried to hide. It was the fire that forged my resolve. If you have ever been cast aside, remember this. You might be the biggest threat to their elaborate lies. Subscribe to Void Revenge Tales to reclaim your own narrative. Your truth is your power. Don't let anyone else write your ending. Tell me your story in the comments. I am listening.